This is the lecture for European history for Wednesday, the 11th of May, 2022. People should have their notes out as we go forward. Yesterday, I realized after we were done that I made a mistake after the movie. Instead of raising the issue with you verbally of why would a free people give up on their freedom, what I would have done, had I been thinking more clearly, it's a good book, is, it's one of my favorites ever, is I would have asked you to write a short paragraph on that same question. Stop whining. No, that isn't what I'm going to do now. But the important thing is for you to come face to face with the reality that people who are free, just like you, have given it up. And that is something that could happen to us. Just as if you're in a family that's prone to lung cancer, you should watch for lung cancer. If you are in a society that is in the heritage of Rome, you should, and other republics, you should watch for the danger signs that other republics have shown before they've given into tyranny. Where we are now, September the 1st, 1939, Second World War begins. And this is the official date. Though many people argue that it was actually 1931 when the Japanese invade Manchuria. That was the first act of aggression in Asia, and an ongoing series of aggressions continue there until August of 45. In Europe, it's September the 1st, 1939, the beginning of the General War. Obviously, for the Soviets and the Americans, the beginning of World War II is 1941. So, we will cover all of this. First off, Hitler invades Poland using forces in East Prussia. He uses an old pre-dreadnought battleship at Danzig, and his forces basically enveloped the Poles in the early days of the war. The Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, destroys most of the Polish Air Force on the ground. There are occasions where Polish Lancer cavalry, this is horsemen armed with lances, are sent against German formations, including panzers. Panzers are the German tanks. If you can't think of a more heartbreaking mismatch than that, that's pretty bad. Because it's better to be a foot soldier against tanks than to be riding a big old horse when they had machine guns. The Polish army is crumpled, and the city of Warsaw, capital of Poland, begins to be bombed. Warsaw is a network of roads and railroads in this part of the world, and the panic that's caused by the bombing is more important than the physical damage that's caused by the bombing. This is the first of Germany's terror bombing attacks, designed to stampede people, to drive them. Because if you're trying to mess with an enemy army's ability to coordinate against you, stampeding their civil population onto the roads so that you can't use them is a very effective method. So, the bombing of civilians, especially in Warsaw, but in more general terms, is designed to do that very thing, to incite terror. And one of the best weapons for this is the Stuka dive bomber, the Ju-87, which I will pause and show some video on. Right light switch, please. A little while. So what we have just seen is, lights again, a recreation of the Stuka dive bomber in action and some actual newsreel footage of the Germans. And the Germans also made it very easy for people in the West to get footage of Stukas and German tanks in action, because this would further terrorize people. So the Poles are being crushed. Warsaw is being terror bombed. the civil population is being terror bombed, and the Polish army decides to organize itself in the eastern third of the country. What they're waiting for is an Allied attack that's going to take pressure off of them, which they expect to happen around the 21st of September. Around the 21st of September, the Soviet Red Army invades from the east, and Poland is divided as the Nazi-Soviet pact intended for it to be divided. Except Lithuania goes to the Russians, and Poland and its general government goes to the Germans. So this ends up roughly being the border between the Soviets and the Germans in Poland. The campaign takes fewer than 6 weeks. Why did the West do nothing? There was a skeleton force on the German frontier, the West Wall, the Siegfried Line. Well, because the West had developed a different mentality, a garrison mentality, a barracks mentality. Feel free to move if you can't see. Between the wars, the largest army in Europe west of Russia was the French army, often considered to be the best army in Europe because the French army was given credit for defeating the Germans in World War I. Around 1930, as the global depression was deepening, French Defense Minister André Maginot decides he has a solution to trench warfare. His solution is to eliminate the trenches with something better. A series of underground fortifications, concrete and steel, called the Maginot, well, called by others the Maginot Line. Along the Franco-German border in Alsace-Lorraine, a defense in depth is constructed, including pillboxes, which are concrete cylinders with machine guns, pop turrets. You have turrets that are under the ground. They go up, and you have heavy guns. When they go down again, they can swivel. All sorts of fire traps and kill zones. Basically a modern fortification. The Maginot fortifications were intended to be proof against poison gas attacks. They had air conditioning. They had a literal underground railroad, not the figurative one we had before the Civil War, but a literal underground railroad. And they had underground hospitals, underground cafeterias, underground barracks. The French were going to fight the war in safety and in style. And the Germans would break against the Maginot Line as the sea breaks against cliffs. That's the idea. That's the Maginot Line. Do any of you see a small problem? Yeah.
I just got around it.
Is that what you were going to say?
I was going to say he could just invade through Belgium. Yes.
Yeah. Because that hasn't happened before. Oh, wait! It did! In the First World War! The Germans didn't attack through Alsace-Lorraine because of the Vosges Mountains and because that's where everyone expected. They went through Belgium. This time, they're not just going to go through Belgium. They're going to go through Belgium and Holland. This is going to be a problem. And the British and the French realize when the war starts, it's going to be a problem. So what they do is, as the Germans are attacking Poland, the Allied forces begin to set up army camps, and they start digging trenches and temporary fortifications along the Franco-Belgian border. But why wait there if the Germans are going to attack into Belgium? So General Gamalin, the French commander-in-chief of all Allied forces, who is, I think, in his 70s or 80s, and who has a headquarters that doesn't use telephones, because telephones are way too modern. No, General Gamalin has couriers. His headquarters is in a mansion dozens of miles away from the border, and he does everything through couriers, like it was Napoleonic times. I mean, telephones were used in World War I, but not him, no. So he and the British, who end up staffing part of the line, have a plan. They're going to move into Belgium as quickly as they can, and if necessary, into the Breda area of Holland as well. And they're going to block a German attack through. They're going to block Schlieffen Plan 2, the second part, at the Deal Canal, halfway through Belgium. Now, you might ask, why don't they march into Belgium now? Because the king of the Belgians and their government, and this is a different king that fought in World War I, believes that Hitler will respect Belgian neutrality, even when the Kaiser didn't. So he's not going to let anyone go into Belgium. Now, if the Germans happen to invade from the east, he's got a bunch of forts to slow them down. And at that point, while the Germans are bogged down in forts like Eben-Emael, the British and the French can move deeply into Belgium and start defending it. But he won't even coordinate with the British and French High Command because that might incite the Germans to attack Belgium. He's neutral. He's neutral in thought, word, and deed. And as a result, the British and French have to wait until the Germans actually attack before they move forward into Belgium. All of this is defensive-minded planning. None of this is going to help the Poles. Had the British and French actually attacked into Western Germany, had the British and French air forces actually bombed the Ruhr and the dams that provide electric power to the Ruhr factories, they might have actually hurt Germany bad enough to possibly cause a rising against Hitler, possibly at least help the Poles in some way. Their position was hopeless anyway. But still, it would have been something. But no, the British and French helped the Poles by digging in between the Maginot Line and the North Sea. On the Western Front, from September 39 until May of 45, it is called the Phony Wars. The Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg, you sit down and fight war by sitting down, is a war where the Germans are in their fortifications, and when they beat the Poles, they move their army westward, and the British and French are in their fortifications, and the Belgians are really hoping neutrality works, and the Dutch are hoping, well, they didn't attack us in World War I, hopefully they won't attack us in World War I, and the British bombed Germany with leaflets, which are pieces of paper that have messages in German written by British and French propagandists saying you should stop fighting the war. War is bad. You don't want your cities to bomb. I mean, we could have just been dropping bombs, but we're dropping leaflets. So don't help the Nazis, which is a really great bit of advice in a totalitarian police state. Yeah. I ended up in a concentration camp because I listened to that stupid flyer. No, that isn't the way it works. So, the war is active at sea for the rest of 1939. And the war in the late winter, early spring of 1940 heats up. Checking what I've said and what I haven't. Okay. So, in the autumn of 39, Hitler and Stalin divide Poland. Poland is gone. There's the Phony War in the West, as I've said. Stalin occupies not only the eastern portion of Poland, but also Lithuania, except for Memel, which the Germans get again. Latvia, Estonia. Now, here, right on the edge of the map, is an area by the city of Leningrad, which used to be St. Petersburg, and Petrograd. It is between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga. This is called the Karelian Isthmus. The Karelian Isthmus is held by the Finns. In fact, the border of Finland at this time is roughly like this. Stalin is an opportunist. He's a bully. He's a predator. And Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia don't provide any real trouble for him. There are resistance fighters, but that's not the same as stopping the Red Army from attacking. So in the winter of 39-40, Stalin decides to launch an attack on the Karelian Isthmus between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga to try to push the Finns back. Now, he precedes this with a German-style press campaign about Finnish atrocities, and he basically demands that the Finns give up the Karelian Isthmus and a good portion of eastern Finland that is strategically located, as well as the port on the Arctic called Petsamo. The Finns say no, and the Finns reappoint Marshal Mannerheim as their war leader. Mannerheim won the civil war between the Red Finns and the White Finns just after World War I. Mannerheim was one of the few foreign leaders that Hitler actually deeply respected. And the only recording we have of Hitler's voice is of a private conversation between Hitler and Mannerheim that was secretly recorded by the Finns. Hitler had a very deep voice. In any event, the Soviets crash into Finland, and the strangest thing happens. Unlike the German Blitzkrieg, which I'll tell you about when we do France, please wait. The Finns, unlike the Poles, which are crushed, the Finns stand. And they do things like wear uniforms with white covers because it's wintertime. The Soviets go in with green and brown, sort of green-brown uniforms. And the Finns have probably the worst fighter plane on Earth. The American-built Brewster Buffalo. Now, the Brewster company made sewing machines, but for some reason in the late 1930s, they sold a monoplane fighter to the U.S. Army and Navy called the Brewster Buffalo. And every time Americans flew the Buffalo in World War II against the Japanese, they got killed or shot down. I mean, 100% of the time. It was a death trap. It was a flying coffin. It was withdrawn after the Battle of Midway. The Finns are the only people on Earth that used the Brewster Buffalo victoriously. I still don't know how they did it. The Winter War turns out to be a bleeping disaster for the Red Army. The Red Army pushes in day after day, week after week, month after month, and the Finns are supposed to be a pushover. They're a small country. Soviet Union's a big country. Vice President Harris said this. Deep wisdom there. So it was expected that the Red Army would just crush the Finns, and the Finns would be lucky to remain independent. No. The Finns hold out. There's a Finnish sniper who was known as White Death, who was asked by an American, I think an American, maybe a British reporter, do you find it hard to shoot people? Because this guy had racked up 50 or 60 kills by this point, and for a single individual, that's a lot. And he says, yes, it's difficult. And the reporter was expecting some big emotional thing. Your target dodges, it weaves, it doesn't want to get shot, it hides behind cover. You've got to be really careful. And the reporter's like... So the Finns basically blunt the Red Army attack and humiliate them. This is going to figure later in Hitler's choice to attack the Soviets, because the Soviet Red Army absolutely fails. Finally, when the thaws happen, and when the mud begins to replace the snow, the Finns accept a peace. And they give up the area that the Soviets wanted. So the new border is not going to include the Karelian Isthmus, it's not going to include a bunch of eastern Finland, and it's not going to include Petsamo. But Finland is left alone, because Stalin realizes these guys are not going to allow themselves to get conquered, and they're making it stick. Trust me, there are people today who are remembering the Finns in the Winter War in the Ukraine. Yes?
Can we watch the video that has Hitler's voice?
Maybe if we have time later. It's an interesting thing, so I'm already considering it. But definitely not today. So, Stalin takes over the Baltic states and tries to take over Finland in the winter of 39-40. But other than that, and other than battles on the high seas, where German ships are captured and sunk, the war in the West is the Phony War. However, a merchant ship filled with prisoners from Allied ships that were taken by the German pocket battleship Graf Spee in the South Atlantic. A ship called the Altmark, a German merchant ship filled to the brim with Allied prisoners, has snuck its way into the North Atlantic, past Britain, and is moving southward along the Norwegian coast towards German-controlled waters. The Brits know it's there. They want it stopped. They want those prisoners freed. The Norwegians know it's there. They're neutral. They don't want to provoke the Germans. The Germans know that the British know it's there. Oh, and the Germans also know that their iron ore shipments from Sweden comes through Norwegian ports and sails down the coast of Norway, the west coast of Norway. So when the British take the Altmark with naval forces, the Germans determine that it's time to end this and to secure our iron supply by taking over Norway. Why take over Norway without taking over Denmark, too? So in March of 40, the Germans launch the first aerial invasion in human history. The Germans simultaneously dropped paratroopers in 5 cities along the Norwegian coast to take control of fortifications and airports. The Germans had pre-staged light naval forces, destroyers, and troop transport ships off the coast of Norway. The German army invades Denmark from the south at the same moment that the paratroops land in Norway and the Germans send seaborne troops in. What's interesting is the British are also simultaneously, they pick the same time, to hit the northern Norwegian ports near Namsos and Narvik to stop the German shipments of Swedish iron ore from getting to the coast. Norway fights bravely. In fact, the Norwegian people are going to be some of the best irregular fighters in World War II, guerrilla fighters. If you've ever watched the Winter Olympics, there's a sport called the biathlon. Mm-hmm. The biathlon is a combination of cross-country skiing and rifle shooting. The biathlon comes directly from the Norwegian experience of using ski-borne guerrilla fighters against the German army during their occupation in World War II. So the biathlon actually comes from real battle experience in the Second World War. Also, in Norway, at the time of Germany's invasion, a Norwegian fascist named Vidkun Quisling rises up and takes control of the government. The Norwegian monarch flees to Britain, and Quisling is made the puppet ruler of Norway. From that time, the name Quisling means traitor. It's like a fifth columnist from the Spanish Civil War. If you call somebody in the United States a Benedict Arnold, you're calling them a traitor. If you call somebody anywhere in the world a Quisling, you're calling them a traitor. So, for example, Carrie Lam, the executive of Hong Kong, who has worked hand in glove with the Chinese Communist Party to end freedom in Hong Kong, could rightly be called a Quisling. She was elected or appointed to serve the people of Hong Kong and protect the one country, two systems policy. Under her watch, it was one country, one system. And the people of Hong Kong are still in chains as a result. So Norway and Denmark are taken over. And the word Quisling is added to our vocabulary. This, not anything before, but this is what finally causes a change of government in Britain. Up until now, Neville Chamberlain has successfully held on to power, even though it was his policy of appeasement that led to war, his policy of promising protection to Poland and then offering up none, his policy of limited war, of leaflet bombing. His entire policy was to restrain, 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 restrain. He was not an inspirational war leader, and it seemed like what he was waiting for was an opportunity to have a peace conference with Hitler. But with the fall of Norway and Denmark, there is finally enough momentum against Chamberlain to cause the king and the parliament to demand a new leader. Now, the likeliest leader was Chamberlain's right-hand man, the tall, thin Lord Halifax, the foreign minister of Britain. And Lord Halifax would have continued much in the line of Chamberlain. In fact, Halifax is going to be very instrumental in the debate over what to do when France falls. Spoiler alert. The other policy is Winston Churchill. Churchill is physically the opposite of Halifax. He's short and stocky, fat, whereas Halifax is tall and thin. And Churchill has been the leading voice, not only in Britain, but in the West, against the Nazis since the early 1930s. He's been warning the world about these people and what they were capable of and what they would do if they got power. And the king prefers Halifax. And the establishment prefers Halifax. Because Churchill seems like the Donald Trump of his time. He seems loud and brash and sort of, he comes from a very noble family, but he's impulsive and impetuous and he's emotional and he wants to fight the war, not just end it. So Churchill's supporters in Parliament beg him to make one promise to them. Churchill and Halifax are being together invited to see the king. And at that meeting, the decision will be made who will be the prime minister. And what everyone expects is that the king will ask Churchill, would you be willing to serve under Halifax? And if Churchill says yes, which Churchill being a person who loves the monarchy and is not a vainglorious fellow, he's not really into power for its own sake, Churchill would say, for the good of the country, yeah, I'd serve under Halifax. At which point it's expected the king would give the premiership to Lord Halifax. His followers made Churchill promise to say nothing, to remain silent. Sometimes silence speaks volumes. Sometimes silence is the most eloquent thing you can say. Remember this in life. I don't often enough. I talk too much. And sometimes that's not the thing to do. Sometimes silence is better. Churchill doesn't have to say no, I wouldn't. He just has to say nothing. And at that point, the momentum might go to Churchill. And we might get Churchill as prime minister. So Churchill makes this promise. And he goes to tea with the king. And the king and Halifax play their gambit. After the greetings are done, Winston, Churchill's first name, would you be willing to serve under Lord Halifax? And Churchill sits there. 10 seconds. 20. 30. 40. Over a minute. And then Halifax speaks and says, as a member of the aristocracy, as a lord, I really don't think it's appropriate that I become prime minister. I think that a commoner like Churchill, maybe from a noble family but does not have a noble title, would be the best to lead. And that settles it. The king says, Churchill or Winston, would you be willing to become prime minister? Churchill says yes. And this is a very important decision in the history of the world, as I will explain later today or tomorrow. So Churchill is made prime minister as a result of failure to keep the Germans out of Norway. Now, the spring rains have ended. The ground is drying. It's campaigning season. We're in early May of 1940. Churchill's been in power 1 day! And he gets a call waking him up saying that the Germans are attacking. Now, the Germans understand the Allied war plans. They're not exactly subtle. They've been building fortifications here for 10 years. So, the Germans launch a massive attack into Belgium and Holland. The Deal Canal Plan is initiated. The King of Belgium invites the British in, and the British and French swing forward to meet the Germans deep inside Belgium and Holland, right about here. But things begin to go wrong for the Belgians almost right away because the Germans do something. At their massive force of Eben-Emael, the Germans land paratroops on the roof. Eben-Emael was not designed for this. The Germans get control of the ventilation and force the surrender of this fort, which everyone expected would hold for months. Eben Emael was incredibly strong on the ground against foot soldiers, armor, even aircraft. But to have paratroopers land and take control of the air vents, nobody expected that. So the Germans are past Fort Eben Emael a day. They're delayed about a day, if that. But as Admiral Akbar would say, it's a trap! Because Hitler is not the Kaiser. And Hitler's general staff is not the old Prussian general staff. When the British and French mobile forces, the best forces in their army, have moved out of France into Belgium, away from the fortifications that they dug, Hitler's real attack takes place through southern Belgium, through a place called the Ardennes. Now, the Ardennes is a hilly forested region that was considered so hilly and so foresty that armored forces and mechanized forces, that's trucks and tanks, could not possibly pass through it. It's like going through a state park. You know, the roads are so small, it would never happen. So because the Ardennes is not considered to be a likely invasion point, it's just guarded. It's not properly defended. After all, the best mobile troops are in central Belgium and southern Holland, not down here in southern Belgium. The first anyone realizes that this has destroyed everything is when German troops take Metz, which is a city right past the Ardennes. The Maginot Line works in the sense that nobody directly attacks it, but it's irrelevant because the Germans go around it. Now, we're going to take a basic comparison between the World War I and World War II tactics. Tactics are what troops use to win battles. World War I trench warfare is like the attack of a forearm in martial arts, or the attack of a slashing sword. It is along a long line of axes. It's a broad attack. You've got thousands of guns peppering the enemy trenches. You've got lines of troops, maybe with tanks and support, moving at walking pace across no man's land to hit the enemy in a broad front attack. It's like a slap in the face. It's a big, broad front attack. That's trench warfare. It's slow. It moves at the pace of a walking man. But that is not what Hitler is doing. Hitler allowed his forces to be restructured by visionaries who understood both tanks and air power. Instead of a broad attack telegraphed by thousands of guns, Blitzkrieg is a strike at a single point in the enemy line. Leading the strike is a spear point of tanks, followed by mechanized infantry, that's troops in trucks. At the same moment, you've got Stukas and other aircraft hitting the same spot in the enemy line that your tanks are hitting. You don't need thousands of artillery guns. You don't need to attack across a broad front. You simply attack one spot until it breaks, and when it breaks, you pour your troops through to the rear, and the enemy will either be forced to retreat, or the enemy will surrender, or the enemy will be able to be killed in smaller units. Blitzkrieg is like a stabbing attack, like a fencer would use with an épée or a foil. The attack comes from the point. It's at one spot. It's like the difference between being hit when you're in armor with a sword as opposed to an arrow. The arrow hits you in a single spot, and all it has to do is break through that spot to defeat your defenses. Blitz means lightning in German. Krieg means war. So Blitzkrieg means lightning war. It was first practiced in Poland, and what the people in the West said when they were told about Blitzkrieg is, yeah, but that was the Poles. The Poles are backwards Eastern European Slavic peoples. We're Western and advanced peoples. That'll never happen to us. It does.
Is that where we get, like, Like in sports?
A blitz. Yes, that's exactly it. It's a strong attack, aggressive attack on a key weakness of the enemy. That's a blitz. So, it's this new form of mechanized warfare that moves at the speed of a tank or a truck. The French actually have more tanks than the Germans. And their tanks are better in the sense that they're heavier armed, heavier armored. They're slow, though. But what the French do is they're preparing for trench warfare. So the French tanks are all dispersed amongst infantry units from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Whereas the Germans concentrate their tanks into panzer divisions, armored divisions that have one purpose: break through and take land. By the time the Germans penetrate to Metz, the critical phase of the battle is over, but nobody realizes it. Now everyone expects the Germans to go to Paris, but that isn't the plan. Instead, the German forces drive to the Channel. The Maginot Line is not a concern. It can wither and die. The concern is the mobile forces that are now in Belgium and Holland. By driving on the sea, the Germans cut them off from their supplies, from their command. Now, there are one or two attempts to attack from the south and the north simultaneously this long, thin German tendril. But the coordination of the forces is awful because General Gamalin is out of his depth. So the French tank division is formed under de Gaulle, who's a colonel at that point and a visionary tank leader, and he's ready to attack, but the attack from the other side doesn't happen until a day or two later because they're not ready yet. And so it's impossible to pincer attack this move, and the Germans arrive at the North Sea, and they successfully cut off these armies. So now, France has none of its best armies. It's got a bunch of troops in the Maginot Line doing nothing. It's trying to scramble its reserves to protect Paris. And what's expected to happen here is the Germans are expected to take the best forces of Britain and France. The British and the French retreat, but city after city in Holland and Belgium are taken. Only the city of Dunkirk in northern France is still open. So the Germans push the British into a smaller and smaller and smaller pocket. And the British and French try to defend their retreat. And Churchill calls for what is known as Operation Dynamo. He calls on the people of Britain to take anything that can float to the beaches and to the dock at Dunkirk and lift our troops off. There are over 500,000 troops in this pocket. Nobody expects this to work. Maybe we'll get 10 or 20,000 over. And then something amazing happens. Hitler orders his troops to stop attacking. Hitler is an old infantryman. He fought on his feet in World War I. Bless you. As much as he is amazed at the speed of his Blitzkrieg advances, he doesn't trust it. He is suspicious that his forces are way too thin, with way too vulnerable supply lines, that the Allies have led his forces into a trap, that the head of his snake is about to be chopped off. So what he orders is the panzers that could have taken Dunkirk Beach in a day or so to halt and wait for the foot soldiers to catch up. He also does this because Fat Goering, the drug addict, the head of the Luftwaffe and the former fighter ace, says that the Luftwaffe can win a battle against ground forces with air power alone. That we will bomb them and bomb them and bomb them and they'll all die. Or they'll surrender. Even now, that doesn't really work. So, For close to a week, the Germans hold off on their attack, and the British have fishing boats and ferry boats and passenger liners and anything that can float crosses from Britain to Dunkirk, and a lot of these ships are sunk by German air power, and a lot of these ships sink because they're not really designed for this, or they're overloaded. You know, you can take 200 passengers, we're taking 400 because we got to get these guys off, and then whomp, you end up capsizing. The British are sending fighter aircraft, including their excellent Supermarine Spitfire. But it's not enough to hold control of the skies over Dunkirk. So the beaches, and this is the clip we saw at the beginning of the movie, are being repeatedly bombed. After close to a week, the Germans, or Hitler, finally realizes what's going on, and he orders the attack. I think it's about 400,000 are brought out. A lot more than 10 or 20,000. The Battle of Dunkirk is the first victory, if you want to call it that the Allies have. It's not a victory because they held ground, it's a victory because they evacuate their talent. There are British and French soldiers who are filled with talent. They have to leave all their guns and all their tanks and all their equipment behind. But the men who have years of training as army officers are brought out. So Britain needs equipment for its army, but it doesn't lose the heart of its army. Now, for years, people have wondered why. Why did Hitler stop? He could have destroyed the British and the French in a shock, a psychological crush. Here's the answer. Probably. Hitler respected the British. He fought them. He didn't fight the French. He fought the British in World War I. The British are also, the English anyway, are Anglo-Saxons. That's Germans. That's Aryans. And Hitler, like the Kaiser, had this weird love-hate relationship with the British Empire, the biggest empire in human history. What Hitler wanted to do was beat the French, take control of the continent, and make a deal where the British agreed that the Germans have control of the continent, and that the British will not oppose the Germans on the continent in any way. In return, Britain can keep its independence, and it can keep its navy, and it can keep its empire. Britain and Germany will be allies. Germany will be the senior partner, Britain the junior partner. But Hitler would never offer such generous peace terms to anyone. That's what he was offering the British. I am personally convinced Hitler did not destroy the British forces at Dunkirk because he didn't want to make the British so angry that they would become intransigent. Because Hitler's calculus was all based on his experience with Neville Chamberlain and Lord Halifax. And both Neville Chamberlain and Lord Halifax were open to the idea. We'll talk about what happens just after Dunkirk tomorrow. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay. Thank you.